All right, AP World History students, welcome to part 2 of the Global Tapestry Networks of Exchange lecture. In this lecture, we're going to focus on Southeast Asia, but be talking about a lot of the same topics. The development and maintenance of Southeast Asian states, belief systems of Southeast Asia and their effect on society. We'll also take a look at some African states as they relate to the Indian Ocean Trade Network. In this case, East African states of the Swahili coast, or the Swahili city-states, will be the concluding part of this lecture. So let us begin. Beginning with 1.3 here, okay? The topic 1.3, explain how and why various states of South and Southeast Asia developed and maintained power over time. For us, it's really more important that we point out what some of these states were, so you have some kind of go-to examples on essays and throughout the course. But a lot of the ideas from the last lecture apply here as well. We're just looking at a different region of the world, okay? So first of all, there were several sea-based and land-based empires that emerged during the Middle Age period, the 1200s to 1450 CE in Southeast Asia, all right? So let's start with the sea-based ones. First thing, in talking about these empires of Southeast Asia, is to once again point out the Strait of Malacca, all right? The Strait of Malacca, if you are looking at the map that shows modern-day Indonesia and the Malay Peninsula and the island of Sumatra and Java, then you can see the Strait of Malacca as well as the Strait of Sunda, all right? This is a narrow strait between the island of Sumatra, the big island towards the left of the map, and the Malay Peninsula, that sort of narrow strip of land coming down from the northern part of the map. That narrow passage between them is what geographers refer to as a strait, right? This kind of narrow ocean passage between islands or landforms of some kind. Except for the Strait of Sunda, which is to the south, right? It is in between the island of Sumatra and the island of Java, just a little bit below. If you follow that big island of Sumatra down, the gap between them and Java is the Strait of Sunda. Well, these were the two main passages between all trade that moved between China and India. Control of this choke point, which made it very easy to tax the trade and commerce that passed through these straits, made several empires very wealthy, as they were able to, like I said, tax the trade that passed through these sea lanes and the ports that they controlled. And again, a repeat from the last lecture, the wealthier and more powerful these states become, the better able they were to protect the sea lanes from piracy and bandits, which in turn allowed more trade to grow and the states to prosper more, and you get this sort of feedback loop to some point. To talk about some of the particulars here, okay, one of the empires that begins at that kind of is at its decline at the very start of our unit here is the Srivijaya Kingdom, or Srivijaya Empire, which is around between the 7th and 13th centuries, okay? So established sometime in the 600s, and it is done sort of in the late 1200s. This is a Buddhist empire based in Sumatra, right? These people were Buddhist once upon a time, as they were frequently in contact with trade from India. A strong navy that controlled the Straits of Malacca and Sunda sort of was the basis of their wealth, as I said before, taxing and regulating the trade that passed through those straits. The island of Java, which I've pointed out to you before there, contains a massive Buddhist temple called Borobudur, which is a great example of the influence of Indian culture and religion throughout the Indian Ocean Trade Network, but especially in South and Southeast Asia. Linda Schaefer calls this Southernization, right? Strayer, the author of our textbook, calls it Indianization, right? The influence that South Asia had, India in particular, right, and Hindu culture, over this entire region, whether it is in customs and clothing and everybody wearing cotton clothes or something like that, or the export of religious beliefs. Now, it is important to note, and I believe Strayer talks about this a little bit, that what is actually happening in Southeast Asia and in a lot of the places of the world where religions are being exchanged is a blending, right? What we call syncretism, more than it is assimilation, right? People are not abandoning entirely their traditional native cultures and beliefs. They are finding ways to sort of fuse them with these new beliefs. If you look at that temple, and if you are able to go into the actual Google Slides and click on the link that I have here for Borobudur, I have a video that is made by the UN, who has mapped out a bunch of spots in the world that are considered these World Heritage Sites, right? Places that are protected for the good of our world culture, right? These amazing things that our ancestors have created and that endure in the world and that we want to keep going. Borobudur is this incredibly impressive temple. I encourage you to Google it on your own or to watch this short video. But this is a great example of how this transfer of religion is a blending, is syncretism, and not just assimilation. On the walls of this temple of Borobudur are stories of the Buddha, but they are set in Java, not in India, geographically, right, in the landscapes that you see. And there are bits of Javanese folklore that make it into these stories. The women in Southeast Asia in empires like Srivijaya or the Majapahit, we'll talk about here, were generally much freer and led more public lives than women in India or in the Islamic world, even after those religions kind of colonized or were transferred to this area. Okay, so the other big empire in this area, and the one that's going to sort of be enduring throughout the period that we're examining here, is the Majapahit Empire, which, again, I'm probably mispronouncing a little bit. But the Majapahit Empire is created in 1293 and ends in 1517. They are another sea-based empire that controlled the entire region shown kind of in the sort of gold yellow on this map here. This map is actually showing the Majapahit capital or empire. And they were founded, as a matter of fact, during the Mongol invasion of the island of Java. So if you remember from the last lecture, I told you that the Mongols influenced the wealth of Gujarat by destroying the city of Baghdad, which is, about as far away in Asia as you can get from the island of Java, right? It gives you some idea of the massive extent of the Mongol Empire we'll examine in a later unit. But it is during this Mongol invasion of the island of Java that the son of the Javanese king at the time tricks and defeats the Mongol forces that were invading there, sort of double crosses them in a sense, and establishes his own dynasty after the Mongols are sort of forced to flee if they want to catch the monsoon winds back home. This Mongol invasion, though, is significant in that it is the first time that gunpowder weapons are introduced into the archipelago here, into the region that the Majapahit Empire controlled or had come to control. And the Majapahit are said to be some of the first people in this kind of Southeast Asian region that were using gunpowder weapons on their ships and in combat, right? Obviously, the Mongols were using it before them, and popularized their use sort of throughout Afro-Eurasia. So again, control and taxation, right? As this empire was sort of able to grow with the use of their gunpowder weapons, and you can see one of these bronze cannon that were constructed maybe as early as the early 1300s or so. A small sort of gun here, all right, but this would have been mounted on a ship and fired what's called grape shot, right? So imagine a bunch of like nails and small bits of metal, almost like a shotgun blast, but coming out of the end of a cannon, right? Devastating if you're on the top of a ship and shot by that. This was used effectively by the Majapahit, and they are able to grow this strong and stable empire and maintain it for some time. And that maintenance comes through, like I've said a lot, their control of the trade that passed through the Straits of Malacca and Sunda. They did struggle with pirates and internal struggles. And in fact, a lot of people in the Majapahit and its surrounding areas would eventually convert to Islam, again, due to the prolonged contact that they had with Muslim merchants as traders and in the diasporic communities that were established there. This would actually see the Majapahit Empire would actually sort of start to decline at some point, not in any relation to Islam or religion or Buddhism or anything, but just as empires do. And it would eventually be conquered by a neighboring Islamic sultanate or kingdom, right? One of these areas that had actually at one point been a part of the Majapahit Empire and had the majority of those people had converted to Islam. This sultanate or kingdom called Demak would eventually kind of conquer and replace the Majapahit. The city-state of Malacca, which is hard to, in fact, see on this map because it's not on there, but in the middle of the Strait of Malacca, in the narrowest part, okay, and you can see where that might be, right, where some of those islands in the strait make it a little skinnier than normal. Well, on the coast of the Malaysian Peninsula, there was a city-state known as Malacca as well, okay? This is a city-state, not an empire. The city was the country, kind of like Singapore is today, that is at the very south of that peninsula, all right? So the city-state of Malacca was situated at the narrowest part of this strait, and it generally served as this meeting point for Chinese and Indian merchants and sailors. The city of Malacca was able to stay independent while surrounded by powerful neighbors because of its very kind of shrewd alliances and leadership. Okay, so if we're trying to think about how and why various states of Southeast Asia developed and maintained their power over time, one example could be Malacca, who was able to, survive surrounded by these, big fish through the alliances and friendships and its own leadership that it was able to produce. When a Chinese fleet, for example, came through in 1407, a Chinese fleet led by an admiral called Zheng Ha, we will talk about this when we talk about China in some detail. But this massive Chinese fleet came through in 1407 and destroyed this pirate fleet that had plagued Majapahit. The city-state of Malacca made a deal with this fleet when it set in at their port and signed a treaty with them and gained China as an ally, a kind of protector in this region while maintaining their own independence, right? They paid China a little tribute, gave them some gifts, and they had China sort of as a protector in a sense. Beyond that, the leaders in Malacca converted to Islam. And, it might be cynical, but a lot of people say that was maybe part of it to gain better trade deals with the Muslim merchants from places like Gujarat or, throughout the Indian Ocean that would come there to trade. So we have this example of sea-based empires, the Srivijaya, which is the older, and the Majapahit, both of them controlling basically the same area of territory, the Majapahit making use of gunpowder weapons to exert control over the area. Although, they're not exclusively walking around with guns, they would still be kind of a rare item in most militaries at that time in this area. But they are making extensive use of them to some degree. And the shrewd alliances they were able to craft with the Chinese, with Muslim merchants, that helped propel their city-state into a stronger power in the region that might have otherwise been. The other big thing there is going to be just what we've said before, is that these states are prospering because of their control of these trade routes, and that in turn is helping to grow these trade routes, right? There were pirates in this area. A strong state was able to smash those pirates, and trade was able to flourish and grow more than before, right? That's a prime example. Okay, to turn our attention to the land-based empires of the region, we will try and focus on just one or two of these places, again, as examples for you. These land-based empires of Southeast Asia were powerful states that made their wealth from agriculture and other products from the mainland. They were not as heavily involved in the ocean-going trade of the Indian Ocean Trade Network. Not that they were not involved, but that they were not as deeply tied into it as places like Srivijaya or Majapahit or Gujarat or these places that we've mentioned before. A lot of their wealth For example, in the Khmer Empire is located sort of where Thailand and Cambodia are today. A lot of the people in Cambodia refer to them still as Khmer, right? That is their kind of like ethnic group, right? We might call them Cambodian as a nationality, but they would call themselves the Khmer people, okay? So the Khmer Empire is well known for its complex and developed irrigation and drainage systems, right? Irrigation is when you're able to sort of redirect the flow of water and water crops and stuff that are far away from a river. And drainage systems were drainage systems that helped them deal with the flooding that happened during monsoon season and as they tried to irrigate their farms. Well, what this did is it made Khmer farmers very prosperous. They were able to plant and harvest multiple times a year and profit greatly from that surplus. So this is the maintenance of their wealth. The Khmer Empire was Hindu, okay? Again, due to their prolonged interaction with Hindu traders and travelers and so on from this region, there are massive Hindu temples at sites such as Angkor Wat, you've maybe heard of, and you can see where Angkor is on this map in the center of the Khmer Empire. Angkor Wat is another incredibly impressive Hindu temple. I encourage you to click this link if you go to the Canvas page and open up the lecture. You can follow that through, and I've embedded a video there of some people kind of flying their drone around Angkor Wat. But watch any video on Angkor Wat, and it's a beautiful temple. But at some point, even despite these massive temple complexes, the leadership in the Khmer Empire and sort of throughout the Southeast Asian area would convert to Buddhism, okay? This connects to one of those cultural themes of 1.3, right? How the belief systems of South Asia influence the region. Well, you have the Khmer Empire that is Hindu and then eventually Buddhist, right? Both of those religions starting in South Asia. The again, I'm butchering these words, but the Sukhothai Empire is going to kind of like overlap this region, right? The Khmer Empire is going to decay and go away, and what's going to replace it is the Sukhothai Empire, a Thai kingdom, right? Like, so again, this is right around where Thailand is, and the people of the Sukhothai Empire are the Thai, all right? This is considered kind of one of the proto-states of Thailand, all right? Similarly, a land-based power like the Khmer Empire that made its wealth from agriculture and taxes, but also engaging in commerce and stuff with the trade routes on the coast to some degree, they themselves would be conquered by another Thai kingdom eventually, the Ayutthaya, that we'll talk about in a later unit. The last thing I'll say on this, as far as like sort of culture and religion goes, is that all of these land-based empires, right? The Khmer, the Sukhothai, eventually the Ayutthaya, although they had some involvement, they lacked that deep involvement in the sea-based trade like the Majapahit or Malacca with the Islamic world or even sort of with the Indian world to some degree. And the lack of that prolonged, extended, frequent contact with Muslim merchants in the Islamic world is probably a major reason why Theravada Buddhism, the kind of Buddhism that's much more monastic, right, with a lot more temples and monks with shaved heads and meditation, right, that's popular in this part of the world. That's probably why that remains so strong. And the reason why Islam never really gained a significant following on the mainland, right? Just because of the lack of interaction. All the valuable trade was going on down there in the Strait of Malacca and in the archipelago of Indonesia. Okay, and this brings us to topic 1.5, explain how and why states in Africa developed and changed over time. And again, there's more to say about Africa. We in this lecture are just focusing on East Africa and their role in the Indian Ocean Trade Network and how that explains how and why these states in Africa developed and changed over time. But this is a topic we will circle back to when we talk about states in West Africa, like you are reading about a little bit this week. We will try to focus on that a little bit closer next week. And also on the states of Central Africa that we will also talk about in later units, okay? Starting with the word Swahili. Okay, Swahili refers to a few things. Kind of this region has been referred to as the Swahili Coast. Swahili refers to a language used by these people. The word Swahili itself is actually a word that means coasters, like people from the coast. And this was the civilization of coastal East Africa. While they were of Bantu descent, and we will talk about the Bantu people of Africa again in a future lecture, they created a new identity thanks to their participation in the Indian Ocean trade networks and their frequent contact with Arab and Muslim merchants, I guess Arab Muslim merchants. For example, the Swahili language is a blending of Bantu and a lot of Arabic words and the Arabic writing script. The Swahili culture widely adopts Islam. Today, much of this area is Islamic, right? Somalia, for example, is right there on the Horn of Africa. And you see goods, right? When we look at the historic sites, the archaeological sites of city-states like Kilwa or Mombasa, Mogadishu, archaeologists find Chinese porcelain and goods from India, right? And all kinds of items that this was a very multi-cultural, kind of cosmopolitan area in some sense, okay? The prosperity of the Swahili city-states and the Swahili coast goes back to their trade relationship with merchants from the north for centuries, right? The rise of Islam in the 7th and 8th centuries was a big turning point in the region's fortunes. Swahili merchants engaged in this frequent trade with Muslim merchants from the north by exporting goods, sometimes slaves of the African interior, we'll talk about that briefly, to the markets of India, Southeast Asia, and China. And conversely, they imported goods such as Indian gold and art and Chinese porcelain into their city-states. The city-states themselves, right, acted again as kind of middlemen, right? There were merchants coming from the interior of Africa, states like Great Zimbabwe that you can see on the map that we'll talk about here in a moment, but other kingdoms and tribes and sort of stateless societies would carry goods to the coast, interact with the merchants there, and the merchants in the Swahili city-states would in turn, barter for that stuff and turn around and sell it to Arab and Hindu merchants and so on at the coast. Sorry, I lost my spot there. Lamu, Mombasa, Kilwa, Sofala. These are all, some of the big important city-states of the area. And that's what all these places are, city-states, right? These are independent city-states, countries that are cities that were, maybe about 20,000, 30,000 people in each of them. Sometimes a little bit bigger, depending on the level of prosperity at that time. And, despite a common language and culture, this area was a lot like the old Greek city-states or something, right? A common language, a common culture and religion, but there was no political unity. All these city-states were sort of on their own and rivals with one another. These societies did have this very intense social stratification between elites and commoners, and Strayer goes into some detail about this in your reading. The other thing I want to make sure that we don't skip over is that there is a slave trade, as I mentioned earlier, going on, right? A major commodity at these ports was people, right? It wasn't as big as it's going to be at other points, but it's going on for a long time. Sometimes this will be referred to as the Indian Ocean slave trade, sometimes as the Arab slave trade. But these people that were going to be sold into bondage, right, were human labor that had been held because of debts that they owed, right? They were debtors, they were prisoners of war, they were criminals, at this time, right? Later on, we will talk more about, how this bleeds over into innocence, especially when we talk about the Atlantic slave trade. But over the centuries, many millions were sold and traded into slavery across centuries, right? I've heard numbers as high as 17 million, which they say, over about 700 years with about 6,000 people being sent a year. Oh, maybe you get to a number close to 17 million. I don't find that unbelievable, but it's probably a little high. It's probably a little high. But probably I've seen numbers, for between 3 to 10 million, maybe at a higher number. There was fewer than 40 million people in all of Africa. So to say that, 17 million people were taken, I feel like they would have noticed that significantly, right? Either way, there is this slave trade that takes place over hundreds of years, right? A trickle of slaves going into the Arab or Muslim world and into the Indian Ocean. The difference is that for these slaves, or Zanj as the Arabs called them, they had a different lot in life, right? The result, what it was like to be a slave in the Indian Ocean world, was generally a lot different and maybe arguably, debatably better than the slave trade that maybe we know about as Americans, the Atlantic slave trade, okay? Which we will talk about in another unit. Indian Ocean slaves often ended up as sailors, right? A slave sailor, or soldiers, or household servants, or as dock workers in ports, right? Not as agricultural workers on plantations or things like that for the most part. If they were slaves in Islamic areas, slaves had certain rights within Islam, right? It's never good to be a slave. You never have enough rights to make it okay. But there were rights such as the right to get married, right? And stay with your wife and children and things like that. Sometimes slaves could own other slaves. Sometimes slavery in the Arab Muslim world was not intergenerational, right? You were a slave, but your kids may or may not be. There are some other differences we will talk about when we get to our unit on sort of the Atlantic slave trade. We will come back to this and do a little bit of comparison with this East African slave trade. It's never good to be a slave, though, no matter where it is, all right? Although we will talk about some places and times where it wasn't the worst thing in the world. Cultural fusions. The East African coast, the Swahili coast, is a great example of cultural fusion. The Swahili cities were home to this very rich fusion of cultures from Africa, the Middle East, like the Islamic religion, the Arabic language, from Asia, all the porcelain and silk and items that could be found there. Like I said, the Swahili language, for an example, is a great example of that blending of Bantu words at the base and Arabic writing and Arabic loan words to supplement it. And then on top of that, these sort of Muslim Africans, right? With the spread of Islam, the east coast of Africa was home to a large populations of Muslims who didn't trace their roots back to the Arabian Peninsula, but did see themselves as a part of the Islamic Ummah. And you are reading about Ibn Battuta as a part of this unit. He travels to these coastal city-states and says they were great, right? And that the Muslims here were very devout. As Muslims here, they saw their fellow black Africans who did not participate and practice in Islam as outsiders, right? So there was this kind of religious divide that forms. We'll see a similar thing when we talk about Europe between Christians and pagans, right? Groups that used to all be Germanic pagans together. Some of them convert to Christianity and start killing their, their fellow tribesmen and stuff, and vice versa. And you see something like that going on the coast here, that these people came to identify more with their Islamic brothers in Arabia and throughout Dar el-Islam than with these, animist or polytheistic Africans of the interior. One of the places from the interior that was kind of integral to this East African trade network were states like Great Zimbabwe. You can see some of the ruins of what was Great Zimbabwe on the slide here, right? These massive stone structures. The word Zimbabwe in the African language that it comes from means a dwelling, right? And so Great Zimbabwe was the place of these great dwellings, these massive stone structures and walled cities for the elite in that area, right? There were a lot of not stone buildings around here that were, most people lived in wooden buildings, and they thought that this city of Great Zimbabwe maybe had as many as 20, 30,000 people in and around it. So again, a decently sized city for the time period, but that helped supply the coast with the kinds of materials that they traded throughout the Indian Ocean world. For example, a lot of gold was thought to come from Great Zimbabwe. There are stories of Ethiopian traders leaving Ethiopia, which is kind of northeast Africa, sailing south down the coast, moving into port somewhere around Kilwa or Sofala, and then marching inland, right? They were probably going to Great Zimbabwe. And the stories were they always came back with lots and lots of gold. So that is thought to be Great Zimbabwe's contribution here, and the source of their wealth from the interior of Africa was gold, okay? Which that area is mineral rich today in all kinds of gold and diamonds. So again, I linked a couple videos here. If you're able to go into the lecture slides and click on these links, the Great Zimbabwe link takes you to a TED Ed video, an animated video that kind of gives you a little bit more details and insight into the culture and people that lived in Great Zimbabwe. The UNESCO video below it is a video made by the UN. This site, Great Zimbabwe, is also a World Heritage Site and protected by UN peacekeepers and things like that so that people don't destroy it or vandalize it and so on. And that gives this kind of more international perspective. I encourage you to please go watch both of them. It can only help you. But that concludes our lecture here, okay? We briefly tried to look at some of the states, how they developed and maintained their power over time, whether it was in East Africa or Southeast Asia. We looked at the belief systems that influenced the societies in these areas, like Islam, like Buddhism and Hinduism. And we examined some other things like the Indian Ocean slave trade and the prosperity that these states gained through their connection to the Indian Ocean world. Thanks a lot, guys. I hope this helps you a lot, and I will talk to you again real soon.